Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, there was a very interesting part of Trump's speech to his general staff last week, which really puts into perspective just how divided and dangerous the internal problems of the U.S. really are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that's definitely worth discussing. I think it has very broad and profound implications because, in essence, part of this is the US's drive to mobilize the military to fight what is termed the internal enemy. And a lot of the time, we, of course, associate the United States with its overseas escapades in places like Afghanistan are being kicked out of there and what's going on with the United States' diminished position in Syria and all over the world, frankly, generally in West Asia as an example. And obviously, suddenly the focus is being shifted to things domestically. And there was a lot of speculation regarding this meeting that was hastily arranged with Trump, Hegseth, and hundreds of these generals, etc., and people high ranking in the US military, where they were called to this meeting, and people going, "Oh, this is going to be because they're announcing a war is going to start with Iran or something," and it was just obviously never the case. On my own podcast, I made the point this is to do with these broad internal changes that are going to happen with the US military and why there was this need or perception now that, as Trump says, that US cities should be used as military training grounds. And Hegseth, who I don't think is particularly popular with the US military at this point in time, called for some new war fighting culture. I mean, but they did, of course, or Trump did, talked about America is under invasion from within. And he was defending basically the deployment of troops in cities like Los Angeles and Washington, where they've had curfews. And in fact, to be honest, they've been pretty successful to a degree in combating a lot of crime. And Trump also said he was going to expand the military's deployment on US soil and saying it was vital to fight crime in US cities. Now, of course, this raises a number of puzzling questions because the argument is, well, why can't existing law enforcement deal with these problems? And of course, does this mean something far more sinister is going on other than just, lawlessness in general? Is this to do with organized crime? Is it to do with entities that are perceived to not have the US interest are? And I'm not going to go into specifics who these entities are because I think generally the problem relates to, as much as anything, entities we're not even aware of. I don't doubt there is huge internal problems in the United States, but whether the answer is to deal with it in terms of the US military, bearing in mind, of course, they've already had this purge of senior US military personnel, and there was, the statement that basically that was going to continue. The grounds for which that happens isn't necessarily clear. And I don't think it relates particularly anything to do with elements in the military who've been critical of the Trump administration. They also lashed out at what they termed fat generals and called for new physical fitness standards. But underneath it, of course, there's going to be concerns because there's this belief that the Trump administration wants to get a stranglehold of the military. And their belief is, well, they're just using this as a sort of show of strength to pursue their own domestic agenda, which doesn't really serve the interests of the broader American people, because they said it includes crackdowns on illegal immigration, on crime. They said violent protests, which, you know, absolutely, if there's violent protests, they shouldn't be allowed. But there's always that question mark with regards to, well, what is this just a move to try and crush anybody who disagrees with the Trump administration? And I'm not suggesting that's necessarily the case or always the case, but there is this concern that this could be sort of this move into having a more authoritarian type government structure, and we're using the military to curb things that aren't necessarily in the broader nation's interest, but this is just to try and curb anybody or anything that is in disagreement with broader, Trump administration policies. Because whatever people think politically, the United States, whilst the left and right, so to speak, as people now refer to it sort of correctly as the uniparty, there is broad differences and broad problems between people who are supposedly sat on the left and people who are supposedly sat on the right. And I think there is general concerns as to what could happen in the US. And I'll leave it as my sort of intro to that, because I think then we'll get into the discussion. Okay, what could be other problems that are perceived to be on the horizon that might require a kind of broader intervention by military personnel because of the severity of those problems?
Yeah, and one of the more important things is this is not an anomaly. The military has been used numerous times throughout history, but after the Civil War, which of course was an instance where a number of states decided that they wanted to, in many cases, they used slavery as the big impetus, but it was dealing with states' rights versus the encroaching federal government over time. But after Reconstruction in 1878, one of the things that Congress passed to placate the South and the American people was posse comitatus. And posse comitatus was a law that said that the military would not be used as a police force within the states. A great example was, of course, New Orleans, where a general ran it under martial law during the last stages of the Civil War. But there were certain key exceptions to the Posse Comitatus Act. The Insurrection Act of 1807, and we already know Trump has used the term insurrection a number of times to send in the National Guard. The National Guard can be used as the federal government appropriates, the Coast Guard, and then emergency assistance like in Hurricane Katrina. That's when the military came in to aid and support. But we have also seen some other key things that really show that the military has a use for civil disturbances. There was the railroad strike of 1877, where the military was sent in by President Hayes. 1957, during the civil rights, where President Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and deployed the 101st Airborne Division. The civil rights riots of the 60s, where troops were sent into Detroit, Baltimore, D.C. Wounded Knee, which was a military conflict between Indian nations, the L.A. riots, Hurricane Katrina, and the like. The important thing is when you take a look, and you have to use logic in this, and you have to get down to the bare bones. What is the definition of terrorism? And that's many of these different things like Antifa or whoever. Do they fall under the auspices of terrorism? If they do, then the federal government has completely the right to send in military troops to deal with it. If not, it falls under the guise of the states. Well, have the states been doing their jobs? That is the big question that has to be answered.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you talk about the fact of sending in National Guard, because that's exactly what the Trump administration did with regards to Portland. I think it was Oregon, and also the governor in Louisiana asked for them to be sent into a number of cities, obviously, in that state. So the question with all this is, okay, clearly there is this belief that the US military isn't fit for purpose. Now, the argument is, okay, are these because they fired something like over a dozen senior military officers already, and there's talk of firing more of them and streamlining the whole military because the belief is sometimes there's just too many leaders and not enough people doing their jobs. And the question, therefore, is this just a feeling that there is, civil unrest brewing and things could get out of control? And therefore, they're putting the measures in place to try and circumvent that problem. Does this relate to the fact or an understanding that given the severity of problems in economies, financial system, that there is a risk that this could cause major problems in across the United States, and therefore then there will be a need under those situations. And I don't know enough about US Constitution or the US law and where it applies, but there might be a situation where the military will be sent in to deal with problems of a pretty serious nature because, just for argument's sake, if the United States really seriously had a massive economic financial problem and a country of 340, 350 million people, would there then be a situation where the military would be deployed because of the potential gravity of the problems? So, over and above what the perception is that there are entities and individuals and groups inside the United States who are very divisive and have been going out their way to cause huge internal problems. I think it goes over and above that, and I think the perception is that within certain corridors of power that look, we do have to start seriously accepting the fact that the United States' economic financial position is deteriorating and we might not be in a position to be able to deal with these problems. How are we going to react to this if something of significant magnitude was to suddenly happen? And therefore, on that basis, they are probably don't want people in the military who would flat refuse to get involved and don't want to deal with internal problems, because the last thing you need if you have a crisis is, no, I wouldn't call it insurrections, probably the wrong word, but you had people in the military who just quite simply would say, oh, I'm sorry, we're not getting involved in that. So I think the idea is they want to put people in place that who will be supportive of the Trump administration if those measures have to be put in place. And therefore, they're saying also the feeling is that the US military, I think they use the term, that it was toxic. There was a lot of bullying going on. A lot of things were not, in place that needed to be in place. Now, there will be people on the, ironically, each side of the political spectrum who will support this, but also be hugely against it because they'll think it's just a way of the right or the Republicans trying to dismantle the left and everything associated with them. And it's political rather than dealing with the perception of significant internal problems. But if you have a country the size of the US and there are significant problems, it's going to be very, very difficult to deal with them if it becomes a problem that spreads across the country. I mean, it wouldn't be the whole country, but if it happens in a bunch of major cities where you're not going to have the resources to be able to deal with that. I mean, and it's interesting, I think, as well, that Hegseth talked about soldiers having maximum authority when fighting. And I'm not exactly sure what that means. That could be very badly misinterpreted. And that the Pentagon, he said, would unleash overwhelming and punishing violence on the enemy. And we also don't fight with stupid rules of engagement. I mean, it's okay, you can say this is all just rhetoric and chest pumping, but underneath it all, if they're serious about this, they're expecting major problems developing. And this is not conspiratorial. I think there is elements inside the Trump administration who do fear this, and therefore dragging all these senior military personnel from all over the world home is to say, you know what, we might still have ideas about where we want to be in the world, and that's a whole separate subject. But we feel and fear that the internal problems and things we have to deal with domestically are going to consume huge amounts of our time and effort, and therefore the military has to be prepared to deal with internal problems of that kind of gravity.
Yeah, and there's something else that's got to be taken into consideration. You're right in having to pose the question. Since Trump is primarily focusing on democratic stronghold states, Chicago or Illinois, New York, New Jersey, California, etc., Portland, Oregon, and Washington, is this more of a political thing? But take a look at what happened within the last 5 to 6 years. We had riots that were paid for by NGOs that culminated in the burning down of large portions of cities, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Chicago. We had these massive funded protests that turned into violence, which is by nature what the definition of terrorism is, violence used for a political purpose. We've seen around the world, you and I have talked about in the past, color revolutions that were funded by entities, states, NGOs, etc., to bring about these artificial, not natural or organic type things. And I'm reminded of a quote from one of the revolutionaries of the 1960s in America by the name of Jerry Rubin. He said this: the hip capitalists have some allies within the revolutionary community, long hairs who work as intermediaries between the kids on the street and the millionaire businessmen. So this concept of NGOs and millionaires, billionaires funding these protest revolutions and et cetera is not new. It's been around for 60 years or longer in America. And what was the protest then? Civil rights and against war, the Vietnam War. What's going on today in many of these things? Well, America is involved in too many different conflicts around the world, and potentially we have economic unrest as well as civil rights. So all these things never got resolved, only now they're getting expanded. And the real question regarding the use of the federal government military apparatus is this. If the states, and I'll give an example, in Chicago over the past few days, there was a lot of protests and attacks on ICE agents to do their job. Well, there was a communique that came from the Chicago Police Department that said, we will not respond to aid the federal government officials if they're under attack. So this is where it gets to be. The states are not doing their job under what federalism is, the Supremacy Act. So if the states are refusing to do and protect the civil rights of individuals, that's the federal government's job. And now all of a sudden you have that gray area. So this is where, sadly, it can spiral out of control. And we know from the Trump administration, he's not going to follow the letter of the law. He's going to follow the spirit of the law. And this is where things can really get out of hand.
Yeah, and of course, it can be used then to make the claim that, well, this is just a politically motivated decision, and that you're going to get elements who'll try to consider trying to impeach Trump. And I think there's already been legal challenges, or there is legal challenges in the works about the role of the US military and if there's violation of the law. And of course, everyone's going to use every US Constitution amendment possible to try and justify their position on this. But the question in this situation is, if you have a sufficient credible threat to the nation as a whole, then surely the argument would be on that basis that the military, if required, would have the right to intervene, just simply on the basis, as you said, if you have law enforcement not prepared to get involved, in a potentially difficult situation, or a situation that would warrant it, then the question is, on that basis, well, could they then say, well, that is not a violation of the law? I mean, as I say, I'm not an expert by any stretch of about US law and what pertains to what in this situation, but I think the idea that the United States, is just going to carry on doing what it's done historically and being the police all over the world is going to change significantly on the basis that suddenly there is a belief that internal problems are not getting dealt with, and internal problems could become a lot more severe because of this whole polarized political perspective that does exist in the United States, and that can be very detrimental and dangerous, but also because of external factors like what's happening economically, financially, and just the fact the United States is not the hegemonic power it once was, its role in the world diminishing, its role as the US dollar being the world reserve currency is diminishing, and therefore instability internally is likely to be far more of a serious problem than it was. And I always come back to this point, with regards to gun ownership in the United States. I mean, as a European, we've never owned guns, and no one really wants to, and no one can anyway because it's not legal. But my philosophy is, looking from the outside, it's all well and good saying, well, you can have guns for defensive purposes. So, you have your right to defend yourself. But when those guns cease to be defensive and risk becoming offensive, then that changes the whole dynamic. And suddenly having, I don't know, 600 million guns amongst civilians suddenly becomes far more of a serious problem. And the question then on that basis, if you perceive that to be an issue in the future, and this is, we're speculating for argument's sake, then I think then the need to have the military involved would take on a whole new level of significance in dealing with this problem. Because, and even then, it's debatable to what extent you could deal with a problem, but I don't think traditional law enforcement is going to be able to deal with that. And I think even the military would struggle on that basis if you ended up with some kind of quasi-civil war happening through a whole bunch of different reasons, through political differences, political entities, and all these little weird factions or entities that are being financed by whoever to cause internal problems. And I think that's something else that would need to be considered, and to take the matter seriously. I don't want to blow things out of proportion, and we don't like to be dramatic about things, but I think the risk of internal problems in the US becoming of a gravity that will be extremely difficult for traditional law enforcement to deal with is perfectly reasonable statement to make.
No, absolutely. And that is such a nuanced thing, because when you go back to, say, the 1940s and World War II, a Japanese admiral, when asked about attacking the mainland of the United States, he said it couldn't be done because there'd be a gun behind every blade of grass. They knew that every citizen, had a gun, so they wouldn't be fighting the military; they'd be fighting everybody. But with that also being said, we had here in Arizona, we had a sheriff, Maricopa County Sheriff, who deputized what he called the posse, everyday regular people who would go through training and armed would provide, complimentary support to the sheriff department and to the police. So gun ownership in responsible hands is a good thing, but you made the point that the things are getting much more chaotic So those same guns in the wrong people's hands can create a whole bunch of unrest. Any other points you wanted to make on this regarding this, Paul?
No, I think that's generally, I mean, this is just a kind of like we always do. We're not here to spend 2 and 3 hours discussing all the details. It's just here's the high level overview of what's going on and why this is a significant discussion point. And there will be people on different sides of the fence politically who will perceive it to be whatever they want to perceive it to be. I'm totally apolitical. I'm not interested in party politics or voting for anyone, but I think there is a perception inside the Trump administration that things domestically could start to become a serious problem potentially. And we need to be aware of this. We need to be ready because if you do suddenly have an internal problem, it's going to be very difficult then in a blink of an eye to be able to mobilize anything to deal with it, not least because how much of the United States' military is deployed all over the world in and basically sat around doing nothing most of the time. You're not going to be able to just on a whim bring them back. So we'll know increasingly based not just on deployments to cities, but what the United States does and what are the ramifications in a broader sense for its 800 bases all over the world and the military personnel associated with these. How many of these are just going to be run on a skeletal staff basis and people are brought home to be ready to potentially deal with domestic problems? And, you know, it's one thing talking about the US in this context, but we shouldn't underestimate the potential risks that this could pose to other countries in the West who could face exactly the same problems, because I fear there are internal problems brewing in a number of countries, and we're not here to get into those discussions, but the UK is one of those. And therefore, you know, the argument is, could traditional police deal with those problems or if they became significant? And the answer is no. There's no way they've got the capability to deal with it. Therefore, you know, it raises similar questions in other parts of the so-called Western world.
Absolutely. And this is a good topic for right-minded listeners from our podcast to, hey, you know what? Discuss it amongst the comments. We'd love to see what thoughts you all have. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.